Good evening, all. Now, in 1972, a crack commando unit was sent to prison by a military tribunal for a crime they didn't commit. Hang on, no, that's the A team. Yes. Now, in 1972, a decisive battle of culture and soft power during the Cold War took place in Reykjavik, Iceland, in the World Chess Championships between the reigning Soviet champion Boris Spassky and his American challenger Bobby Fischer. This wasn't just another chess match in the World Championship. This was actually an exercise of soft power between the two superpowers during the Cold War. And America's victory, or Fischer's victory, was a decisive blow to the Soviet cultural projection around the world. Now, when you cannot fight a war between these two superpowers without mutually assured destruction and the destruction of most life on Earth, both superpowers and the West and the Warsaw Pact in general would find other ways that they could gain dominance. And culture was one of the ways. If you could project yourself as a superior culture, you would win the dominant aligned nations of the world to your side. That was the thought. Neither the Soviet Union or America in this period were particularly isolationist. They sought to project their power, their influence, their culture around the world. And the Soviets had two dominant ways of doing this. One was classical music, and the other was chess. Now, with classical music, they arguably had three of the greatest composers of the 20th century in the form of Prokofiev, Khachaturian, and quintessentially Dmitri Shostakovich. They'd also produced one of the world's greatest ballet dancers, if not one of the greatest ballet dancers of all time, in Rudolf Nureyev. But the relationship between Shostakovich and the authorities was always fraught. He'd been purged twice in his lifetime. He'd gained favour with the Soviet authorities, but he spent a huge amount of time not in their favour. They never quite got his music as people in the West did. And as for Nureyev, he went and defected in the early 60s to the West, and the Kirov Ballet's loss became the Royal Ballet's gain. The other thing was that they had one of the greatest cellists of all time in Slava Rostropovich. Rostropovich, however, in 1968 decided to dedicate one of his performances to the vanquished Czech uprising, the people of the Czech uprising in 1968. That didn't sit well with the Soviet authorities, and he was sent away to a building site for a while until he recanted. So the Soviet Union, although they were dominant in the world of classical music in the 20th century, it was never an easy relationship. However, with chess, they were the dominant ones. Starting in 1948, they won their first World Chess Championship with a chap called Mikhail Botvinnik. Botvinnik, being one of the greatest chess players of all time, developed a very ruthless, brutal system of playing chess. His tactics were one of utter domination, bullying his opponents. Not that much sophistication to it, but a lot of clinical knockout punches with it. And he was chess champion for, I think, the longest period of time until Garry Kasparov many years later. But he was dominant, and not only that, he'd also dominated the Soviet chess system. He became its preeminent exponent, and young players coming through the system, they would be sent to academies at a young age, much like talented sportsmen and women would be identified at a young age and sent to a sporting academy. So too with chess and the Soviet Union, and Botvinnik dominated that scene. So from 1948 through to 1972, nearly 25 years, the Soviets were the world champions. And not only did they like being the world champions, they also liked being the contenders as well. As well, I have to explain a little bit about the rules of the World Chess Championship. Now, it's run on a 3-year cycle, and it's a bit like boxing in the way that the champion doesn't have to go through all the qualifying matches. They are the champion until a contender knocks them off their perch, and the contender becomes the next world champion. So it starts off with something called the zonal competition, which is you try and be the champion of your own country. And the top players from the zonals then go on to something called the interzonal, where top players from many different countries and regions compete against each other, and the top 8 of those go through to a round called the contenders. And the winner of the contenders round then is the official challenger to the world champion. Now, the Soviets didn't just like having the world champion, they also liked it if the contender was Soviet as well, and as many of the candidates in the candidates round could be Soviet as well, that would be just fine and dandy. They loved it like that. They would love to not just win the world chess champion, but absolutely demolish the rest of the world, shut the rest of the world out of even being the challenger. So the Soviets, to do that, the Soviets became very good at getting their players to play for draws sometimes, getting the points win, so a favoured challenger could go through to become the official challenger, and the rest of the world players would be left with having to score big wins to become the official challenger. And of course, with the Soviets all agreeing to draw against each other, manipulate the system a little bit, they could completely dominate. Now, this worked out very well for the Soviets until the mid-1950s, when a young American player, Bobby Fischer, emerged on the scene. Even as a 10-year-old, Fischer could play 20 simultaneous matches of chess against all types, all comers, and win. By the age of 14, he'd actually been invited to visit and tour the Soviet Union, play competitive matches there. And it was an experience that Fischer particularly hated. He hated communism, he didn't particularly like the Russians, and he spotted this kind of colluding and cheating, and even at the age of 14 were calling the Soviets a bunch of cheats, and that he refused to play them. Now, even before he'd reached the age of 20, Fischer had written a book, My 10 Greatest Matches. He was a celebrity. He'd been interviewed on television. He was widely expected to become the challenger. Nobody could stop Bobby Fischer from becoming the official challenger to the world title. And he was expected to compete in 63, 66, and 69. In 63, he came unstuck during the Soviet kind of rigging of the system, and he lost out. He called foul. Nothing was done about it, and the Soviets went through. And so for 66 and 69, Fischer took himself out of the equation. He was happy to be the US champion, which he was multiple times, but he refused to enter the World Chess Championships, as he was expected to do. And so the great Western hope of chess kind of secluded into solitary self-imposed solitary confinement, which he was apt to do in his life. And so people felt that something was missing. The greatest player in the world wasn't going to compete on the greatest stage. Anyway, by 1969, the Soviets produced yet another champion, but this one was a little bit different. He didn't stick rigidly to the Botvinnik system. He was very much a freestyler, his own man, both in his personal life and on the chessboard. His name was Boris Spassky, and he brought a little bit of excitement back into chess, frankly, after the years of just being ground down by these very methodical, very correct Soviet grandmasters. Spassky seemed like a bit more of a freewheeler. Anything could happen when Spassky played chess. And people liked that. They warmed to him because of it. So Spassky had actually played Fischer when Fischer was a teenager touring the Soviet Union. Spassky was 2-0 ahead in that head-to-head contest. And so the Soviets were confident that their man would win again in 1972, especially if Fischer again decided not to play. But in 1970, Fischer suddenly announced he wanted to play in the 1972 title, so the process began in 1970. And there was just one problem. Fischer wasn't the US champion, so he wasn't eligible to go through to the zonal round, and then the interzonal, then the candidates rounds. But, and not for the first time, things were changed. The rules were changed. Things were altered to accommodate Bobby Fischer. The actual US champion of that year decided to cede his place in the interzonals to Fischer and allow Fischer to play. The US Chess Federation allowed this. The International Chess Governing Body, FIDE, allowed it as well. You see, this was the thing. Even though, strictly speaking, Bobby Fischer was circumventing the rules in order to play in the World Chess Championship, this is Bobby Fischer. He's potentially the greatest player of all time. And everybody wants to see the Soviets brought down. Just the Soviet domination is getting too much. Everybody's looking for the great Western hope, and Fischer is it. So yes, they're going to bend the rules to allow this festival of chess, the ultimate Soviet freestyler versus arguably the greatest player of all time. It has to happen somehow. Now, you'd think that the Soviets would find an easy way to retain their championship. All they have to do is stick to the rules, make a protest, and ban Fischer. This is something they could have done a lot of times in the 2-year period between Fischer announcing his candidacy and the matches themselves. But they didn't, because they thought, hang on, if we can take down Bobby Fischer, we can prove the Soviet system is the best. The Russians didn't want to get by on a technicality. No, they wanted to crush Fischer. And they thought in Spassky they had the man to do that. So what happened next was fascinating, if you like chess. But I think it's fascinating as part of Cold War history as well. Fischer went on to absolutely annihilate all opposition in both the interzonal and the candidates matches. In fact, he set the record for the most number of matches won in the candidates round. Nobody had ever won their first 6 games out of 8 in the candidates rounds before. Fischer did that. He absolutely crushed his opposition, including a Soviet grandmaster called Mark Taimanov. Now, Taimanov was a talented classical musician. He was also a chess grandmaster, and the Soviets, coached him and gave him all the support he needed to take down Fischer. And Fischer absolutely trounced Taimanov. The Soviets thought he hadn't been trying hard enough against Fischer. And so not only did he lose his job in the orchestra, he was booted out of the Russian Chess Federation and was ritually humiliated, sent off to his dacha as a form of punishment. The Russians were incensed that Fischer was just cruising now past all comers. And this started to rattle them, that perhaps Fischer was too good for them. So by the time the chess championship took place in Reykjavik, Iceland, a very unlikely place, but one of Fischer's demands, the Soviets sent a huge support team around Spassky. This wasn't really Spassky's style, to be told. Even having Botvinnik look over his shoulder saying, no, don't try that in the match, Fischer will have you. Spassky wanted to do things his own way. He wanted to have his own downtime with his wife and his children, didn't want to be bothered by Botvinnik and the Soviet apparatchiks that were following him around. There were still problems to overcome. A few days before the matches were due to start, and when Fischer was expected in Reykjavik to formally register, Fischer no-showed. He didn't get on the plane. He'd vanished for a few days. Well, they finally managed to track him down. Fischer was saying he wouldn't play because he had certain demands that wouldn't be met by FIDE, mostly concerning money. What happened was that it took a phone call from the US Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, to convince Fischer that he should go and play in the World Chess Championship, because it wasn't just about money and his personal pride. This was East versus West. This was a battle to be fought in the Cold War. Kissinger inspired Fischer with a kind of a patriotic rhetoric about how he owed this to the free world. The whole world wants Bobby Fischer to win. Now, Fischer himself is quite a difficult character, and I'm putting that mildly. He's not the easiest person to like. He's a kind of extremely intense, psychotic, at times malevolent figure. But he is the best chess player in history, and he represented the free West. We don't We don't choose our champions. The champions suddenly appear, and we have to. And if we recognise that they are champions, you get behind your man, and that's what the world did. This is what FIDE did. This is what everybody did. They wanted Fischer to play. They were going to bend the rules to accommodate him. Well, during the matches themselves, they were extraordinary. The way the competition unfolded, the drama was very much off the chessboard as much as it was on it. Fischer's game was a mixture early on of very dashing, daring, aggressive plays. Sometimes he was successful, sometimes Spassky beat him. And then there were other times when Fischer was adopting the kind of military grind down tactics that Botvinnik would have been pleased of. Fischer varied his game. He was hugely unpredictable in these matches. Even with the huge Soviet backroom staff containing former world champions, they couldn't really predict what he was going to do next. They thought they could predict if he did this in this match, he's not going to repeat it in the next match. Oh, he has. Then he's more likely to do that. Oh, he's just done a move that he's never ever played in his career up until this point. Why is he starting now? This was Bobby Fischer had just tuned himself into a chess playing machine. But not only that, he employed everything that William Potter's Stephen Potter's gamesmanship books would have been extremely proud of. Fischer was hypersensitive. He could hear the whirring of cameras in the auditorium, so he wanted the first 8 rows of the spectators removed to create more space between the chess table and the audience. And even when that wasn't good enough, he demanded that the match be moved to a back room in the conference center where the matches were being taken place, and a single video camera feed from that back room to the main auditorium was all that people would see of the matches. And only the FIDE officials, Spassky and Fischer, would be in the room. This was bad news for the documentary film crew that paid quite a lot for the film rights of the World Chess Championship that year. So there was intensity on and off the chessboard. Spassky wasn't immune himself. He was becoming increasingly paranoid and worn down as the match progressed. Even at one point, complaining that there was something in his chair, something vibrating in his chair. He felt that perhaps the Americans, the CIA, maybe even his own people, he had been having fights with Botvinnik behind the scenes, but also KGB men started showing up in the Soviet entourage, and they started paying particular attention to Spassky's movements, his conversations, and everything. And Spassky at one point complained that the chair he was sitting on, there was something wrong, somebody had tampered with it. Well, the chair was taken away and x-rayed, and it was found that there was a strange shaped rectangular piece of metal lying athwart the back of the inside the lining of the chair, and it wasn't part of the chair's design. Well, this was very strange. They changed chairs for Spassky, and the original chair with the thing in it vanished, and there was no trace of the mysterious device, even though the chair was x-rayed. Fischer himself thought that the Soviets might put microwave transmitters into the cameras to mess up his brainwaves. And yes, there were KGB men hanging around the Spassky entourage, taking mysterious phone calls at all hours. So Spassky was becoming paranoid. Fischer was already paranoid. But the difference between the two men is that Fischer turned his paranoia into brilliant chess, whereas Spassky just became increasingly more rattled and irritable. Anyway, Fischer won decisively and became the world chess champion. And this was a huge blow to the Soviet Union in terms of prestige and pride. Now, let's look at the aftermath to see how much of an impact it had. Well, the Soviets could always claim that they were dominant in the culture wars for a long time. You know, they had classical music and they had chess, and they had dominated chess like no other country had done before or since. What could America give you? Rock and roll and Coca-Cola and a cartoon mouse. See, the thing is about projecting soft power is that the Soviets were very good at restricting what stuff from the West was coming in to their country. Our free society, on the other hand, could take most of what Soviet culture. So when the Soviets project classical music around the world, they show it as a sign of achievement. And chess was like that. They could go around the world and just say, We are the undisputed masters of this. But Fischer broke that. And if one person could do that, then another. The system might throw up another. It never really did. Fischer was a one-off, but in terms of propaganda and in terms of breaking the Soviet system, the Botvinnik system was effectively broken by Fischer. And even though the next two world chess champions were Soviets and they dominated for many years after 1972, they were very different men. They came more from the Spassky tradition than they did from the Botvinnik one and the official Soviet schools. They were Anatoly Karpov and Garry Kasparov. Interestingly, a few years after becoming the Soviet champion, Karpov defected to the West. Kasparov was always anti-communist once communism had fallen, and in the Glasnost era he became a vociferous critic of the Soviet system, and even today he is a huge critic of Vladimir Putin. It's got him into trouble a few times, but he is more one of these free thinking. He is the inheritor of Spassky rather than Botvinnik. As for Fischer himself, he kind of largely vanished from view for many years. He refused to defend his title a few years later, citing that the money wasn't good enough, and FIDE hadn't agreed to all his proposed format changes for the championship. FIDE actually agreed with Fischer on a lot of things. They wanted to end the kind of Soviet domination, so they tweaked the rules to end short draws and manipulate the system. These were Fischer's suggestions. They thought they were good, but Fischer had more. It was never enough for Fischer. And so he slunked away for about 20 years, emerging in Serbia in the 1990s to have a rematch with Spassky. There's lots of myths about people playing Bobby Fischer online on Yahoo Chess back in the early days of Web 1.0. Largely apocryphal. But this was an exercise in soft power, that the United States had beaten the Soviets pretty much at what they considered their own game. And even in the world of classical music in the 70s, the Soviets started losing the grip on that. Shostakovich died in 75, and then when they thought they had the new Nureyev, who cares about Nureyev anymore? We've got Mikhail Baryshnikov, and Baryshnikov defected to the West as well. So Soviet soft power took a huge dent in the 70s, at the time when America was struggling with the post-Vietnam malaise, the energy crisis, and the torpid presidency of Jimmy Carter. So the Russians had one more chance in that time to pull off a major cultural coup. And as it so happens, they were going to host the 1980 Summer Olympics in Moscow. And it looked like that would be a slam dunk, that the Soviets could just once again project soft power and get an edge in the culture wars over the rest of the world. The only thing that could muck that up is if they stupidly got themselves involved in a war with another country. And that's where I'm going to pick up the story in my next video. Until then, have a great night and get out the old chessboard. Your children could be the next Bobby Fischer. I hope not.